welcome to Long Live the Queen, where we talk about the women who made history. And by we, I mean the royal we, because it's just me. Today, we're going to talk about the Great Famine. When you think of the Dark Ages, you probably imagine 1300s Europe. Also, we don't say the Dark Ages anymore, we say the Late Middle Ages. The late 1300s were the time when the peasants were starving and the plague was going around. For the last 300 years since the Norman conquest, Europe had enjoyed a population boom, and that population bubble was about to pop. The population, at the largest it had been, combined with prolonged cold temperatures, led to a lot of famines. There could be a crop failure any year, and there wouldn't be much food that year. But in 1315, a famine started that would be known, in the time of famines, as the Great Famine. In the spring of 1315, it rained in Europe. A lot. Way more than usual. It was wetter and colder than usual. Wheat crops were planted, but the temperature stayed low, and it continued to rain throughout the summer. Weather patterns had changed dramatically since the previous year. The wheat didn't ripen. The crops failed. And they didn't just fail in France or England. Wheat crops failed all over Western and Northern Europe that year. Some wheat was placed indoors in pots, urns, or other containers to keep it dry. The straw and hay crops could not be cured, so the animals were about to be hungry as well. Because of all this rain, lowlands in Europe flooded. Food prices began to increase quickly. By midsummer of that year, they had doubled in price. Salt was needed to preserve the meat over the winter, but with the weather, salt became very hard to find and quite expensive. They obtained most of their salt by evaporating brine. Things didn't evaporate well when it's always wet. Salt pricings went from 30 shillings to 40 shillings. In Lorraine, wheat prices increased 320%, making it unaffordable for the peasants. The population had grown to a point where even a minor crop failure would mean people would starve. They had almost no margin of error. In a good year, Europe was making about the same amount of food that they were consuming. Wealthy people had some food stores, but if you weren't wealthy, you were probably foraging out in the forest, trying to find edible roots, grasses, nuts, and bark. By the end of summer, the King of England stopped off at the city of St. Albans, and the city had trouble finding food to serve the king and his friends. When the king can't find food, then it's a great famine. In Bristol, the city records say a great famine of dearth, with such mortality that the living could scarce suffice to bury the dead. Horse flesh and dog's flesh was accounted good meat, and some eat their own children. The thieves that were in prison did pluck and tear in pieces, such as were newly put in prison, and devoured them half alive. The King of France, Louis X, the quarrelsome one that was maybe cursed, he tried to invade Flanders. Now, I don't usually cover the battles, guys. There are tons of podcasts that do that. But battle wasn't what happened here. In an attempt to invade Flanders, they passed through the low-lying areas of the Netherlands. It wasn't exactly flooded, but the soil was so waterlogged that the army got bogged down and just stuck in the mud. They were forced to retreat, leaving all of their provisions behind because they couldn't carry them out. By the next spring, all sources of food reserves had been exhausted. Even the wealthy were out of food, and it continued to rain. It had been raining for a year. The fields were so muddy they couldn't even be plowed this year, so new food wasn't on the horizon. They were desperate, so people were doing previously unthought of things. They slaughtered their work animals. If the mule couldn't pull the plow, they were eating the mule. Once the draft animals were eaten, they didn't really need seed grain. How would they plant it? So they ate it. The future was not looking bright. Some families with many children would abandon the children they couldn't afford to feed, hoping someone else would. Enter Hansel and Gretel here. Older people would voluntarily starve to hopefully help their younger generation survive. And there were many noted accounts of cannibalism. Word on the street was that people would dig up new graves for food. But that may have just been word on the street. We have no actual evidence of that, but a lot of stories. But we were now on to the spring of 1517, 2 years after that very first wet summer, and it was still raining. But by the summer of 1517, weather patterns started returning to normal. By then, the European population left alive was weakened by starvation and illness, and they had eaten most of their seeds. It took about 8 years to build the food production up to the levels it had been before the Great Famine. Somewhere between 19 and 25% of the European population died from this famine. But also buckle up, because in about 30 years after this famine, the bubonic plague pops up in Europe, and that killed about 1/3 of the remaining population. The Great Famine affected all of northern and western Europe. Scandinavian countries, the Netherlands, Scotland, Ireland, England, Wales, France, Germany, and Poland. A poem survives today. When God saw that the world was so overproud, he sent a dearth on earth and made it full hard. A bushel of wheat was at 4 shillings or more, of which men might have had a quarter before. And then they turned pale, who had laughed so loud, and then they became all docile, who before were so proud. A man's heart might bleed for to hear the cry of poor men who called out, "Alas, for hunger I die." And that is where I'll leave it for now. What did you think of the Great Famine? It was great in an awful way. The decades following the Great Famine led to an increase in crime. People had felt forced to do things to keep themselves and their families fed, and I think this changed the people of Europe. They had together experienced something terrible and were sort of trauma bonded, and things were about to get so much worse. You can share your thoughts with me at longlivethequeenpodcast@gmail.com or on Facebook or Instagram at Long Live the Queen Podcast. Long live to all the queens out there. And until next time, bye. This episode was brought to you by my patrons, and you can join the party if you want. The link is in the show description.
You'll be remembered.
Thanks for listening.